My name is Olivia. I'm 33 years old, and the morning of my wedding felt like waking up inside a dream I'd been chasing for years. The air in the hotel suite smelled of perfume and peonies, sunlight spilled over the floor, and, for once in my life, I wasn't anxious about anything. I'd spent months worrying over every detail, the seating chart, the flowers, the playlist. But that morning, everything seemed to fall into place. My reflection in the mirror looked calm, almost unreal, in the soft satin of my gown. My friends moved around me, laughing, adjusting earrings, touching up lipstick. The hum of excitement in the room was steady and warm, like the soft strum of a guitar before a song begins. My mother kept checking her watch, reminding me to eat something, fussing with my veil, as if the world depended on it. She looked proud and nervous all at once, the same expression she wore when I left for college. My father, quiet as always, just gave me that small approving nod. It felt right like the calm before a chapter you've waited your whole life to turn. I remember thinking, this is how it's supposed to feel. Then Ethan arrived, my older brother. He walked in unannounced, as usual, carrying that same mix of charm and unpredictability that had followed him our whole lives. Ethan was the kind of person who drew every eye in the room without even trying. At every family gathering, he was the entertainer, the centre. I was the quieter one, the planner, the one who held things together when he went off script. We'd had our share of arguments, but I'd always believed that deep down he wanted the best for me. When he hugged me, I noticed the faint smell of whiskey on his breath. "You look different," he said, smiling just a little too long. "Didn't think you'd actually go through with this." I laughed it off, though the comment landed heavy. "Ethan, not today," I said softly. He shrugged, hands in pockets, and turned to compliment my mother. He was smooth like that, able to shift moods in an instant. As I watched him leave the room, I felt something tighten in my chest, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way his smile didn't reach his eyes, or the edge in his voice when he said Daniel's name later during photos. But I pushed it away. It was my wedding day, and I refused to let old patterns steal from it. Outside, the garden looked like a movie set, rows of white chairs, sunlight flickering through trees, a string quartet tuning in the distance. Daniel stood under the arch, looking nervous and beautiful in his grey suit. For a fleeting moment, I forgot about everything else. I only saw him. And yet, somewhere in the crowd behind him, my brother's laughter rose above the music. Sharp, careless, like a warning I didn't know I should have heard. The ceremony began perfectly, the kind of moment that feels too still to be real. The quartet played softly, guests turned in unison, and I walked down the aisle with my father's arm steady in mine. Every sound, every heartbeat felt magnified, the crunch of gravel beneath my heels, the faint rustle of my veil, the way Daniel's eyes lit up when he saw me. For a few precious minutes, everything aligned. I said my vows without trembling. He smiled through his, and when we kissed, people actually clapped and cheered. It was the kind of joy that fills a space so completely it feels like nothing could touch it. Then the reception began. The sun was sliding lower, golden light bouncing off champagne glasses and silver cutlery. Laughter spilled across the tables, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself to relax. I remember leaning on Daniel's shoulder as the photographer called for group pictures. My brother stood off to the side, tie loosened, drink in hand. He hadn't said much since the ceremony, just smirked now and then, watching. At one point, he disappeared into the bar area, and I thought maybe he'd gone to cool off. When it was time for the toast, my maid of honor spoke first sweet and sentimental, the kind of speech that makes half the room tear up. Daniel's best man followed, cracking jokes, making everyone laugh. Then Ethan stood. He hadn't been asked to speak, but of course that never stopped him. He clinked his glass, swaying slightly, eyes bright with something I couldn't name. "I just want to say a few words about my little sister," he began, and the crowd quieted. He started light-hearted, making jokes about our childhood, about how I used to follow him everywhere. People laughed politely. Then his tone shifted so subtly at first that most didn't notice. "You know, it's funny," he said, glancing at Daniel. "Olivia always dreamed of this perfect day. She planned every second of it, almost like she was afraid if she didn't control everything, it would fall apart." A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the tables. I felt heat rise in my face, but I forced a smile. He kept going, talking about how some people hide behind perfection, how appearances can fool you. The room grew quiet. My mother's hand froze on her glass. Daniel looked confused. Then Ethan lifted his champagne and said, almost lazily, "To the happy couple. May this be as real as it looks." And before I could react, he swung his arm, sending the champagne flying straight across the table, across the cake, across the silk of my dress. Gasps echoed around the garden. The glass shattered at his feet. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The string quartet fell silent mid-note. I could feel the cold liquid dripping from my chin, the heavy sweetness of icing breaking the air. Ethan stood there, chest heaving, eyes wild, as if daring someone to speak. Then, slowly, I set down my napkin, looked right at him, and didn't say a word. The silence was louder than any scream could have been. Silence hung in the air like a curtain, thick and suffocating, but my mind had already drifted somewhere else. Back to all the moments that led us here, the small cracks that had been forming long before the glass ever broke. Ethan had always been unpredictable, but growing up, I thought that was what made him special. He was the kind of brother who could make an ordinary afternoon feel like an adventure. When I was 8, he built a makeshift raft out of old wood and pool noodles and convinced me we could sail to the next town. We didn't make it past the backyard pond, but I remember how proud he looked when I laughed instead of crying after we both fell in. I worshipped him then. He was fearless, bold, everything I wasn't. But things shifted when we got older. Ethan never adjusted to being an adult. He drifted from job to job, always with an excuse, always blaming someone else. When my parents helped him pay off his credit card debt, he called it family loyalty. When I lent him money for his car, he promised to pay me back as soon as the next deal came through. That deal never did. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, bank statement open, convincing myself it didn't matter. That's what family does, right? We help each other. When Daniel entered my life, Ethan's distance grew sharper. He'd tease me about Daniel's calmness, say he was too clean, too proper. I think deep down, he resented him. Maybe because Daniel represented everything Ethan couldn't hold on to. Stability, responsibility, peace. The last time the three of us had dinner together, Ethan had a few drinks and started talking about how some people marry out of fear, not love. Daniel had handled it gracefully, but I saw the tension in his jaw. I laughed it off again, pretending it was just Ethan being Ethan. That was my mistake. There was another moment I can't forget. 2 years ago, after my mother's surgery, Ethan promised he'd stay at the hospital with her overnight so I could rest. The next morning I found her alone, half asleep, asking where he'd gone. He'd left before midnight. I didn't confront him then. I never really did. I just kept forgiving, patching, smoothing things over because the alternative, cutting him off, felt impossible. He was my brother. Standing there at my wedding, champagne dripping from my dress, I finally saw the pattern I'd refused to see for years. Every time I gave him another chance, every time I stayed quiet, I was giving him permission to keep breaking things, my trust, my patience, my peace. The champagne wasn't the first time he'd thrown something precious away. It was just the first time he did it where everyone could see. And as people around me whispered, waiting for me to explode, I realized how many years I had spent cleaning up after his messes, defending him, pretending it wasn't as bad as it was. That day, for the first time, I didn't move to fix it. I didn't apologize. I didn't rush to explain his behavior to others. I just stood there, silent, watching the man who had been both my protector and my undoing unravel in front of everyone. After the toast, the room seemed to move in slow motion. Guests murmured to one another, unsure if they'd just witnessed a scene or a meltdown. My mother was frozen in her chair, my father's jaw tight enough to crack, and Daniel stood beside me, wiping champagne from my shoulder with a napkin that couldn't possibly fix anything. Ethan just stood there, breathing heavily, half smiling as if he'd accomplished something noble. For a few seconds, I wondered if maybe he wanted me to yell that he was baiting me, dragging me back into the same exhausting dance we'd been doing for years. But I didn't. I looked at him, completely still, until the silence became unbearable even for him. That's when he spoke. "Oh, come on, Liv," he said, his voice cutting through the whispers. "You can drop the act now. Everyone knows this isn't real. You've always been the good girl, the perfect planner, trying to make everything look flawless. But it's fake, just like you." Daniel took a step forward, but I caught his wrist. "Don't," I whispered. My voice was calm, almost too calm. I turned to Ethan. "Why are you doing this?" He laughed, but it wasn't his usual carefree laugh. It was brittle. "Why? Because I'm sick of pretending. You think you're better than everyone now, marrying Mr. Perfect, buying that house, playing the saint while Mom and Dad bend over backwards for you. You always get everything, Liv. You always have." I could feel every eye in the garden on us, the air thick with discomfort. My voice came out lower than I expected. "You think I get everything? You think that's what this is?" I stepped closer so only he could really hear me. "You've taken more from me than you'll ever admit. Every loan, every apology I've made for you, every time I covered your mistakes because I thought you'd finally grow up. But you never did. You don't want help. You want a villain." He blinked, thrown off for a moment, then smirked again, masking whatever flickered behind his eyes. "There she is," he said. "That's the Olivia I know. Cold. Always pretending she's too good to feel anything." I took a slow breath. The wind picked up, stirring the tablecloths and sending pieces of cake sliding toward the edge. I looked at him, really looked at the unshaven jaw, the glassy eyes, the hand gripping the bottle so tightly it trembled. He wasn't angry at me. He was drowning in something he couldn't name, and for the first time I didn't feel pity. I felt distance, the kind that can't be crossed again. "Go home, Ethan," I said quietly. "You've done enough." He tilted his head, almost curious. "And what if I don't?" Daniel's voice came then, steady and low. "Then I'll have security take you out." Ethan's smirk faltered. He glanced at the guests, his audience, and realized he'd lost them. The sympathy he expected wasn't there. No one was laughing. No one was defending him. For once, I didn't rush to soften the moment. I didn't offer him a way back. He threw the empty bottle down, glass splintering across the grass, and stormed off toward the gate, muttering under his breath. The sound of the metal latch closing behind him was sharp and final. I stood there for a long moment, the wind cooling the sticky champagne on my dress, and finally let myself breathe. The reception stumbled back to life in fragments, music starting again, people awkwardly chatting, but something inside me had already shifted. I wasn't the same Olivia who'd walked down that aisle. Something in me had cracked open, not from his cruelty, but from the quiet realization that this time I wasn't going to fix him. That night, Long after the guests had left and the last of the candles had burned out, I sat alone in the bridal suite with my wedding dress crumpled around me like the ghost of the day I thought I'd have. The mirror across from me showed streaks of makeup and the faint shimmer of dried champagne on satin, but I barely saw any of it. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, the glass shattering, Ethan's voice cutting through the laughter, my own silence hanging like a verdict. I should have been angry, but what I felt instead was clarity. For the first time, I could see the full shape of what my brother had become, and the part I'd played in keeping him that way. Every memory of him asking for help, every night I'd stayed up worrying about his next mistake, every apology I'd made to our parents on his behalf, all of it led here. I had mistaken my loyalty for love. I'd believed that if I just gave him enough chances, he'd find his footing. But he never did, because I was always there to cushion his fall. It wasn't compassion anymore. It was surrender. Daniel came in quietly carrying 2 mugs of tea instead of champagne. He didn't say much, he didn't have to. He sat beside me, our shoulders touching, and for a long time we just listened to the hum of the city outside. Finally he said, "You don't have to pretend this didn't hurt." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I know, but I think I'm done pretending a lot of things. I told him how I'd spent years trying to be the glue that held my family together, even when it was breaking me. How I'd covered for Ethan because it was easier than watching my parents' disappointment. How every "it's okay" I'd whispered after his outbursts only made the next one easier for him. Daniel nodded slowly. "So, what are you going to do?" That question echoed in my head for hours after he fell asleep. By morning I had an answer. I wasn't going to fight Ethan or try to fix him again. I was going to take back everything: my peace, my boundaries, my sense of control. No more surprise visits, no more lending money, no more half-hearted promises to keep the peace. I would speak to a lawyer, finally separate my name from his debts. He'd used my credit more than once when we were younger, always swearing he'd handle it. Now I wanted it clean. More than that, I decided to write him a letter. Not an apology, not a plea, just a line he couldn't cross anymore. I would tell him I loved him, but that love didn't mean access. I would tell him that I hoped he found help, but I couldn't be the one to give it. And most of all, I would tell him that silence, the one thing he had mocked me for, was not weakness. It was the sound of letting go. By the time the sun came up, the world looked different. My dress still bore the stains of the night before, but somehow it felt lighter on my skin. I poured myself a cup of coffee, looked out at the quiet streets below, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel responsible for someone else's chaos. I felt free. The following week, I went from the quiet hum of the honeymoon suite to the sharp efficiency of my lawyer's office. The contrast almost made me laugh. Just a few days earlier, I had been smiling for photos in a flower-filled garden, believing that chaos was finally behind me. Now I was signing documents that would make sure it never followed me again. My lawyer, a calm woman named Claire with a voice like steady rain, slid the papers toward me one by one. "You're taking back control," she said simply. "Most people talk about boundaries. Few actually draw them." We went through everything. The joint accounts my parents had opened years ago with Ethan's name still tangled in them. The old business registration he'd once used to secure a loan, even the lingering traces of shared property from when we'd inherited our grandmother's cottage. Every page I signed felt like closing a door that had been creaking open for far too long. Claire promised she'd send official notices within the week, ensuring that from now on, my finances and my future were mine alone. When I told my parents, the conversation wasn't easy. My mother looked wounded at first, as if I were cutting off a limb instead of a person. "He's your brother, Olivia," she said, her eyes soft and pleading. "Family doesn't abandon family." I swallowed hard. "I'm not abandoning him, Mom. I'm refusing to abandon myself." It was the first time I'd said those words aloud, and hearing them felt like taking a breath after years underwater. Daniel stood by me through it all, never pushing, never speaking for me, just there, steady, his hand finding mine at the right moments. One evening, we drove out to the coast where we were supposed to have taken our honeymoon. We didn't book the resort. Instead, we found a small bed and breakfast, overlooking the ocean. The air smelled of salt and pine, and for the first time in a long while, I felt uncluttered. I brought my letter to Ethan with me, the one I'd written the morning after the wedding. I mailed it from a tiny post office on the edge of town. No return address. Just my handwriting, steady and sure. In it, I told him the truth he'd never let me speak, that I loved him deeply but not destructively, that I was done cleaning up his wreckage, and that if he ever wanted a relationship again, it would have to be one built on respect, not rescue. I didn't expect a reply. I didn't need one. Weeks passed. There were no angry calls, no apologies either. The silence was strange at first, but eventually it became comforting. I threw myself into work, into rebuilding the rhythm of a life that was mine. Daniel and I began planning a smaller celebration. A dinner with just close friends, a symbolic restart. When I looked in the mirror that night before bed, I saw the same face, the same eyes, but something behind them had changed. I realized that taking action wasn't about punishing Ethan. It was about reclaiming myself. Every signature, every boundary, every quiet decision was a thread weaving a new life, one no longer dictated by guilt or fear. The chaos that once followed me like a shadow had lost its shape, and in its place there was only stillness, the kind that doesn't feel empty, but earned. A month later, I received the first ripple of consequence, not from Ethan, but from the family. My mother called one evening, her voice careful the way people speak when they're balancing sympathy and disappointment. "Your brother came by," she said quietly. "He looked lost. He said you've cut him off from everything." I could almost picture him there, sitting at her kitchen table spinning his story like he always did. I took a deep breath before answering. "I didn't cut him off, Mom. I just stopped letting him use me." There was silence on the line, then a sigh, long and weary. "You always were the strong one," she whispered, though it sounded more like a confession than a compliment. After that, the distance between Ethan and me became a fact everyone had to live with. Family dinners were quieter. Invitations were more carefully worded, some addressed to Daniel and Olivia, others to the family without specifics. At first, it hurt more than I wanted to admit. I'd grown up believing that family was unbreakable, that no matter how twisted things became, love would glue them back together. But the truth was different. Love can exist even when connection has to end. I hadn't destroyed my family. I'd just stopped playing the role that kept it pretending everything was fine. Ethan tried reaching out once, an email short and defensive. He said he didn't mean for things to go that far, that he was drunk, that he'd been going through stuff. The same vague explanations he'd used for years. He didn't apologize, not really. There was no acknowledgement of what he'd done, just an undercurrent of self-pity. I read it twice, maybe 3 times, and then deleted it without replying. It wasn't anger that stopped me, it was peace. I finally understood that silence wasn't a punishment. It was protection. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened with Daniel and me. That day at the wedding could have fractured us, but instead, it fused us closer. He saw me at my most exposed, humiliated, heartbroken, stripped of the illusion that I could fix everything, and he stayed. Not out of pity, but out of understanding. He told me once, "You didn't lose your family that day. You found yourself." And as much as I wanted to dismiss it as sentimental, he was right. We eventually moved into the cottage I'd inherited, the same one Ethan and I used to visit as kids. It felt poetic, almost defiant to rebuild something new in a place that carried so much history. We repainted the walls, repaired the porch, planted herbs by the kitchen window. On weekends, we'd sit outside with coffee, the sea breeze soft against our faces, and I'd realize how quiet life had become and how much I loved it that way. Occasionally, I'd hear updates about Ethan through relatives, another job he'd left, another city he'd tried to make work. Each story stung a little less. I'd stopped hoping for redemption and started wishing for his peace instead. Maybe someday he'd find it. Maybe not. But either way, it was no longer my responsibility to carry his storms. The day I finally unpacked the last wedding box, I found a fragment of my old veil tucked between photo albums. I held it for a long moment, tracing the lace, thinking of the girl who'd walked down that aisle believing silence was weakness. That girl didn't know that sometimes silence is the loudest boundary you can set. And in the quiet of my rebuilt life, I felt something rare and whole, relief that I had finally chosen myself. I sat in our new home in our cozy corner, surrounded by the changes that felt so long awaited. Every corner of this place, every update, symbolized the new chapter I was beginning in my life. For months, I had grown accustomed to the silence that filled my life after that day at the wedding. I was no longer the girl who tried to control everything, the one who thought her role was to save everyone. But then, one ordinary Tuesday, I received a letter. It was just a few lines written in Ethan's familiar handwriting, but despite its simplicity, it made something inside me stir. He wrote, "I'm sorry. I'm trying, Liv. Maybe not enough, but I'm trying. I'll never be who you wanted me to be, but I'm trying to become someone who can stand on his own. I don't expect anything from you, just wanted you to know I'm still here, even if I don't know what that means yet." I froze, holding the letter in my hands. My first instinct was to tear it up, to throw it out the window as if it didn't matter. But the longer I stared at the words, the more I remembered the boy who built a raft with me in our backyard, the brother who once was my protector. Time had changed him, and I was ready to admit that, but I couldn't completely let go of the image I had of him in my heart. I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer. The decision came to me almost immediately. I wasn't going to save him. I couldn't keep carrying his weight, but maybe, just maybe, I could give him space to figure it out on his own. That night, sitting beside Daniel by the window, watching the stars appear one by one, I realized that the greatest gift I could give myself and my brother was space. Space to grow, to stumble, to rise again. I wasn't saving him anymore. I was saving myself. And that, in itself, was enough.